So welcome everyone. Welcome to the London Buddhist Centre. I always want to say really good to see you. I actually can't see anyone. What I can see is the live chat starting to appear in the chat room, in the chat box. So, but in my mind, I sort of can see you. Yeah, I sort of feel like I can see you, even though I can't. But welcome everyone to the London Buddhist Centre. We've got a really special evening this evening, which I'm going to introduce. And then we'll do a very, very short meditation, and then I'm going to hand over to Subhuti and Suryagupta, who I'll talk about in a moment. But just to say, some of you have been joining us for a while now. We've been exploring, Yanavatra and I have been exploring parables from the White Lotus Sutra. I found that a really valuable thing to do every Thursday evening. Yanavatra and I have just been looking at the images of one parable after another from the White Lotus Sutra. And as one so often does with parable, finding so much meaning in it. But tonight we're going to sort of suspend that for a while, for tonight, because we've got a special evening. Subhuti and Suryagupta are going to talk about Buddhism and race. Yeah, they're going to be talking about Buddhism and race. And you don't need me to say why they're going to be talking about the issue of race, the fact of race and racism and so on. You don't need me to say why they're going to do that. But we really want to give it, a good amount of time. So we're going to have a special elongated evening, a 2-hour evening. So I'll say, in a moment, I'll say something more about, very, very briefly about Suryagupta and Subhuti, at least why it's them talking. And then we're going to do a very short meditation. I just thought we'd be great to start with, here we are in the London Buddhist Centre. Behind me, this wonderful image made by Chintamani of when the London Buddhist Centre opened in 1970, an image of enlightenment, an image of going beyond all difference, but going beyond all imaginable and even unimaginable prejudice. So I wanted us to start here. We wanted us to start here. And then we'll start with a little meditation just to ground ourselves in our experience, just to come back into our direct experience of our body, just for a few moments, really, just to settle in. Wonderful to see the stream of comments coming in. Yes, really, really wonderful to see. I better not look at it too much, otherwise you don't think I'm looking at you. First of all, a very brief introduction to the two of them. I'm really delighted that we can be hosting this conversation. First of all, Subhuti. I wanted to say what Subhuti, his relationship to the London Buddhist Centre. So he's the president of the London Buddhist Centre. Sometimes people find that a bit, what does that mean, the president of the London Buddhist Centre? Basically what Subhuti is, who Subhuti is a very dedicated Buddhist practitioner. He's dedicated his life to the Buddha Dharma. He's been practicing Buddhism very intensively in his thought, in his speech, in his actions for many, many, many years. He's been teaching a lot, for instance, in India. He's a friend to the centre, effectively. He's someone with a lot of experience who can help the centre, be a friend to the centre. Yeah. So that's what a president means. That's why Subhuti is talking, because he's a president of the London Buddhist Centre, a friend to the London Buddhist Centre, someone who's really been practicing the Buddha's way, Buddhism, what is called the Dharma, for many, many years. So he's got a lot of experience of the Buddha Dharma, of Buddhism, to use a Western word, under his belt. And he's in conversation with our chair, the chair of the London Buddhist Centre, Suryagupta. We're really delighted that they can have this discussion together this evening. Suryagupta is the chair of the London Buddhist Centre. I thought I'd just very briefly say what that means. So the chair of the London Buddhist Centre is someone who, in relationship with a whole network of other people, is responsible for the spiritual direction of the centre. Yeah, for the spiritual direction of the centre. She works with a whole range of people, for many, many people. I know how many people Suryagupta is in contact with. And she's particularly responsible for the spiritual direction of the center. So that means you could think of it as very simply as two things. First of all, making sure that the doors of the Buddhist center metaphorically are open to all beings, open to everyone who wants to learn about Buddhism, meditation, mindfulness, who wants to come. One of her main responsibilities is making sure that that's really alive, that we're really welcoming people, that we're opening the doors to people. And then you could say that she's responsible for making sure that, finally making sure, in liaison and in communication and friendship with many, many others, she's responsible finally to then making sure that everything that we're teaching here at the London Buddhist Center is a pathway to enlightenment, is a step, little tiny gradual baby steps perhaps, but it's all moving in the same direction towards enlightenment. So that's Suryagupta. She's the chair of the London Buddhist Center. Subhuti is the president of the London Buddhist Center. And what we're going to do this evening is we're going to do a very short meditation, as I said, and then I'm going to hand over to Suryagupta and Subhuti, and they're going to have a conversation together, and you're going to be watching that conversation, and you're making comments in the chat box, so you can make comments. A thing to flag up right away is that there will be chance for questions, and I'll say a little bit about that in a moment. So already you'll be wanting to think of questions. We want to make this as interactive as possible, so it's not like watching television. But for the first section of the evening anyway, Suryagupta and Subhuti will be in conversation. That will take us up to about 10 to 8, something like that. And then Suryagupta will call a tea break. Every time we have a class here at the London Buddhist Center, we always have a tea break. You'll need to take charge of your own tea break. That gives you've got about 10 minutes just to go and get yourself a cup of tea, make yourself comfortable, go to the loo and so on. So you'll have a 10-minute break. And then as the time moves towards that 10 minutes, at 8 o'clock, Suryagupta will kick off again, and they'll talk for a little bit more. We don't know how much, depends how their conversation is going. They're wanting to, just see how it goes. So they'll be talking a little bit more, and then there'll be a space for questions from something like quarter past 8, 20 past 8, all the way up to around 10 to 9. And so chance for questions. And so do put questions in the chat box. So Sanjay, who's one of our tech team tonight, we've got Sanjay and Matt here at the moment, who are the tech team there. They live in the community with me upstairs. He'll take over from me in that questions, and he'll collate some of the questions together. So, say if there's 3 questions about this and 4 questions about that, he'll collate them into one question, and he'll take over from me and say, oh, Subhuti and Suryagupta, a few people have been asking this question. And Suryagupta, she's saying that she might also try and keep an eye on the chat as well and see whether she wants to weave some of your questions in during the conversation. But we want to make sure there's enough time for questions. And then we'll be finishing the evening at 9 o'clock. The only other thing to say is just for those of you new to the London Buddhist Center, particularly welcome to you, new to this, new to the London Buddhist Center, new to our online events. Just to mention that the next thing I'd really encourage you to come to is this course, a week-long course we're doing next week, which finishes with a day retreat marking Dharma Day, where you can learn meditation and deepen meditation in the morning at 8 o'clock or 8:15, and then we've got special classes every night in which we'll explore the whole of the Buddhist path. So the idea of this course, called The Road to Full Potential, I'll get the tech team to just give you the link for that, because you'll need to register for that. I'll get Matt to put that in the chat. So the idea of that week starts on Monday is that you can learn meditation, deepen your meditation with meditation teachers in the morning, and you can learn the whole Buddhist path in a week and then have a day retreat at the end. So I'd really, really recommend that. Okay, that's enough for me for just a moment. So let's just spend just a few moments. I know that if you're like me, you've been on lots of Zoom meetings today. You've been on screens quite a lot. So let's just spend a few moments closing our eyes and meditating. So sitting yourself comfortable, as comfortable as you can on the your chair, wherever you are, or lounge sofa, or wherever you are, making yourself comfortable. And when you're ready, closing your eyes. As soon as you've closed your eyes, see if you can come away from thoughts, planning, fantasizing, imagining, remembering, that kind of world of thought that we get captured in. Buddhism has a word for it called prapuncture, so your mind spreading out and so on. And we need some perspective from that so that we're not just coming from that very constructed part of our experience. And the way we get perspective on our mind is by get perspective on our thoughts, on our prapuncture, on our mental proliferation, is by really feeling our body. Feeling the weight of our body on the floor, on the cushions or the chair. And really giving yourself to that. And just notice how you are just now, if you can. And you don't need to think about that, you just get a sense of how you're doing just now. Are you okay? Not okay? Just really broadly, I just sense an overall kind of sense of how you're doing just now. Just so that you're bringing yourself into this evening. And then just taking one or two deeper breaths, just to settle your mind, calm your mind. And then broadening your awareness to include, again, more and more of your body, how your body feels just as it is just now on a Thursday evening. And if you're in the UK, it's been very hot today. But many of you are not in the UK. So just a sense of how you're doing, the temperature of your body just now, temperature around you, the sounds around you. And then when you're ready, opening your eyes. Okay, good. So without more ado, I'll hand you over to the chair of the London Buddhist Centre, Suryagupta.
Thank you very much, Macha Bandhu, for introducing us and introducing us to the whole evening, giving us a lovely, clear orientation for what we're about to do, which is have a conversation. And the conversation is entitled Awareness is Revolutionary, Race, race, caste, and Buddhism. So thank you very much for all of you tuning in. I've had a quick look at the chat on the YouTube and seeing you come from all over the world, many familiar names. It's really wonderful to have you with us this evening. So yeah, thank you for joining us. And if you're listening to the recording as well, thank you for tuning in. And I'm also really delighted to also welcome Subhuti. Machu Bandhu really gave a good sense of what the president is. And he is all those things, Subhuti, have been a real influence in Sri Ratna as a whole at the London Buddhist Centre, which he helped found, been a president for all these years at the London Buddhist Centre, and he's been a friend to me and to many, many people in the UK, Europe, really around the world, and also especially India, and more latterly Hungary as well. So yeah, warm welcome to you, Subhuti. I can't see you at screen at the moment, but maybe that will happen. I don't know. But I'm looking at the Buddha, and that's a lovely image too. So yes, I thought I'd share firstly why this event happened, why this event came into being. Machu Bandhu said, of course, we know why we're having this event. But for me personally, I've been having various conversations with friends of mine, and I'm involved in the People of Colour group. So I was having conversations there, and I was also getting emails and letters from Sangha members saying, we want a conversation, we want a broad conversation around race in the events, following the events in the US, and then globally. And I was thinking about the how to do this really. And I was meditating one day, and basically I thought, the title is Race, Caste, and in my mind it was the Dharma. And then Subhuti just appeared in my mind. And I thought, well, I could just have a conversation with Subhuti and share that conversation with lots of people, with you. So really that's what happened. I got up from my meditation seat and checked my phone, and I got a message from a friend of mine, Jayakara, and she said she knew I was wondering about the how to have a conversation, and the message said, Suryagupta, why don't you have a conversation with Subhuti on race, caste and Buddhism effectively? So I immediately contacted Subhuti, who emphatically said yes to the conversation. And in a way, we've been having this ongoing conversation over the years. So this is really a chance for us to share our conversation we've been having more publicly, really. One thing I'd say about this conversation is that, well, no conversation, as we know, is perfect. And you know, we're none of us are experts here. In fact, I don't like to think of myself an expert in anything. I like to think of myself as someone who is on the journey of learning and discovery and deepening awareness and deepening understanding. So I would say that really I'm keen for all of us here to see if we can learn something really tonight, learn about ourselves, each other. I'm going to be learning perhaps about Subhuti, as I'm going to be asking him questions, maybe sharing some of my own reflections as well. And yeah, just really getting a sense that yeah, we're on this journey. And I think the only difference about, you know, where we are on that journey is how committed we are to this journey of deepening awareness around, in this case, race. How committed we are, and obviously personal experiences as well can make a difference. But I would like to think that we're all here to understand this area a bit more deeply. But my aim really for tonight, and I'm going to ask Subhuti what his is in a moment, but my aim is really just to have a conversation with my friend Subhuti, have you all involved in that conversation too, through your questions and comments. But in the hope that we stimulate more conversations, more constructive conversations in our community around race, so that we can all collectively feel that we're understanding the area more deeply and well, caring about the area in a really productive way that helps us all. So that's my aim. Subhuti, I'm going to ask you anything you want to add to why we're doing this evening together tonight.
Well, like you, I immediately felt when these events started unfolding from the dreadful killing of George Floyd, that I wanted to contribute positively, and I wanted to see our movement, our order, the Dhamma, brought into the heart of that this upsurge of feeling that has arisen. And although there's a lot of frustration, anger, pain being expressed, and all sorts of things expressed on all sorts of different sides of the issue, my overwhelming impression is that this is a unique moment when there is a very strong feeling from society in general, of course there are many exceptions, that we want to see the end of the problems connected with race. And I felt that I wanted to contribute to that, and I wanted to see the Dhamma as part of that. So I hope that, like you, I hope that through this conversation with my friend Suryagupta, that we would be able to promote a positive and constructive perspective, which is at the same time real and genuine, and not ignoring the unpleasant features of the issue. So yes, I very much hope that through our conversation that this will stimulate us in Triratna to be a very positive force for change in this whole area. And I'm very happy to have that with you, Suryagupta, because we've talked a lot about this over many, many years, but especially since you became chair. And we have such an easy mutual understanding from which I've personally learnt a great deal.
Thank you. Yes, we just had a check-in, didn't we, about this conversation, and in the course of that, we just sort of kept getting into the conversation and sort of, and it was really, I found it very engaging talking with you, Subhuti, very enjoyable. And every now and again, one of us would say something, and this happened the other day where I was like, oh, Subhuti, when you said that, it landed like this with me. And then, we would talk about it and clarify it. And in a way, we've given each other permission tonight, as it is live, to actually have like a real conversation. So, Subhuti, you might say something, I might say something, and we might need to clarify, we might need to check in with each other. In a way, that's how we've managed to keep this really live, engaging conversation going over the years, is because we've been so very honest with each other, and sensitive to each other as well. So we're going to do that in the spirit tonight as well.
And we will make mistakes.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's my way of saying.
Please forgive us in advance.
Okay, so I'm going to jump in now. Ask you a few questions, Subhuti, as a way to set the scene for this conversation. So I had the title, Race, Caste and the Dharma, or Race, Caste and Buddhism, and you added the words, awareness is revolutionary. So I wondered if you could say something about that. Where did it come from, and what revolution are we talking about?
Right, yes. Well, the phrase is an aphorism of our teacher and founder, Urgyen Sangharakshita. I believe it's contextless. I haven't checked it up. I think it's just one of those aphorisms. And in fact, in the very early days of the movement, I come from before the flood. And in those days, we even had a little badge which said, awareness is revolutionary. And I think people had T-shirts saying, awareness is revolutionary. So that's where it comes from. I know it's very, very appealing to my friends in India. The idea that awareness is revolutionary. But when we say revolution, we of course do not mean a political revolution. We're referring to what we talk of in India as a Dhamma revolution, a change in human consciousness, a change in human relationships, which is based in the Dhamma. And so when we say awareness is revolutionary, we're saying it's awareness that is the fundamental force that brings about that change in our own experience and in our relations with each other, and therefore in society.
Right. Okay.
But I must admit that you sort of indicated you might ask me this, and my mind got to work on it, as it won't. And I realize it's a very, very big topic, because it really strikes at the heart of the Dhamma. What is awareness? really what awareness is ultimately is is beyond all differentiation. It's beyond all identification. It's beyond all clinging. So if you become aware, if you become more aware, you make clear to yourself your own clinging and your own identification, and you're able to let go of it.
Mm-hmm.
And even you could say that that happens in relations to others. So, you know, for instance, in this interaction, as probably people have noticed, you come under the category of black, I come under the category of white, and I use category advisedly, maybe say more about that. But so in that interaction, there is so often a degree of sensitivity and delicacy, and even fear, and often strong feelings connected with it. So if I can be more aware of that in myself, I can open up to you. And if you, which you don't, but if you gave me feelings that were hard, as it were, for me, I could open up to that and see where you were coming from and try to understand.
Yeah.
So awareness changes the relationship, and it gets us free from these categories that divide and polarize us.
So ultimately gets us free from all the constraints as well, and that sense that we're separate from others.
Yes, yeah.
Ultimately, yeah.
Which happens in any human interaction.
Yeah.
Every human interaction begins with a polarization. You are you and I am I. But then that gets loaded on with all sorts of other things. It gets on, you know, coming from a certain class, your class might have, you know, your accent might have had an effect on me. You're a male or a female, you're gay or not gay or whatever. All of that may polarize further, and race is a particularly powerful polarizer. Right. So awareness takes us beyond that without denying actual reality.
Lovely. So I think you've raised a few things there. So we're going to come back to the whole thing about identification and identity sort of later on, but still setting the scene, I think. You mentioned India.
Yes.
You mentioned they call it the Dharma revolution in India. And I thought we could just start in India around caste, because in a way in Triratna, we've learned a little bit about caste through the work of Bhante and Dr. Ambedkar. And I'm very interested in, well, let's start with the Buddha, actually. Let's start with the Buddha. What was the Buddha's view of caste? Was the Buddha anti-caste?
Oh my goodness, absolutely, unequivocally. And in fact, the extraordinary fact, which has not been much noticed, is the very first human interaction he had after his enlightenment. In the legendary accounts or the semi-legendary accounts, it was the third week or the fourth week, he encountered a Brahmin who asked him what makes a Brahmin. And of course, one assumes a subtext that what he was basically saying is, I'm the spiritual person, you don't have any right to sit there. So the Buddha gives a very strong, very clear, unequivocal message, which is that what makes you a Brahmin is not your birth, but your worth. That's what Dr. Ambedkar's paraphrase of it. So it's your moral and spiritual worth that makes you a Brahmin. Of course, he was trying to reevaluate a caste term and turn it into a moral term. It didn't succeed. But so I think that's very, very striking. The very first human interaction he had, he challenged the hierarchical social order. And
so this is his first interaction post enlightenment.
Yes.
Right.
Sitting under the Ajapala Nigroda, the goat herd's banyan tree, which if you go to Bodh Gaya, it's at the bottom of the steps that take you down to the level of the Mahabodhi temple. There's an Ashokan era pillar there that marks that spot, which I think is deeply significant. And it shows that the Buddha was revolutionary from the start.
I was going to say, how radical was that in his day, and how would that have been seen by the rest of society, him taking that stance, as it were?
Well, I think that at the time of the Buddha, what historians have revealed to us is that that part of India was being Brahminized. In other words, it was being made into a caste environment. And the Buddha was vigorously fighting against this. And he did so unequivocally all his life. And he was challenged again and again by Brahmins who were looking for dominance. And he fought against it all the time and spoke out against it absolutely unequivocally. So this would not have been widely accepted.
Right. Yeah.
For instance, he made it absolutely clear that his Sangha was free from caste. And he said, you know, there's the famous image of all the rivers in India, when they reach the ocean, cease to be the Ganga or the Yamuna or the Brahmaputra or whatever. They just become the waters of the mighty ocean. So every caste, every community, and you could say every race, to use that constructive term, they all become just members of the Sangha.
One of my favorite stories, actually, of the Buddha is where the story of Nidhi, where it's basically somebody who's really been cast out of society. I think he carries, the waste materials to the edge of the town, as it were. And he basically hears the Buddha's coming to the town that day, and he basically wants to escape the Buddha because he doesn't think he's worthy of being in the Buddha, around the Buddha. So he basically tries to find ways at the Buddha, but the Buddha, through powers, detects Nidhi trying to escape, as it were, because he doesn't feel worthy, and he goes in pursuit of him. And he basically is a really powerful story when I first heard it, because it's very much around he saw Nidhi's actual potential that was nothing to do with his caste, nothing to do with the fact that his livelihood was carrying waste. He saw his potential and went to him and said, come. And really from that, what I've understood as well is that many people from the lowest caste and outside the caste system even became some of the Buddha's great teachers. So even in that context, really upending the system that was going at the time. And
very consciously.
Very consciously. So obviously since then Buddhism died out at some point in India, and then we had Ambedkar in the 50s, 40s, really coming into his own, coming from an untouchable background himself, becoming educated, becoming a politician, trying to change the system, as it were, the society, through politics, through laws, through policies, and getting some way, making some successes, but ultimately he didn't feel he succeeded in what he really wanted to do, and he converted to Buddhism, and took all his followers with him, or took many of his followers with him. What effect has that had, do you think, on Indian society, that the fact that so many people followed Ambedkar, embraced Buddhism, and left the caste system?
Well, of course, in the larger scale of the population of India, it's relatively few. It's still a huge number, and there are estimates vary enormously as to the number of Buddhists in India today, but it could be as many as 100 million, and with varying degrees of understanding of what that means. But perhaps that's a little high, but certainly Dr. Ambedkar has had a seismic effect upon India. And that effect continues, especially for those who are so-called lower caste. They see him as their way forward, as their leader. And he was a man of enormous probity and moral character and stature. So they could justifiably have faith in him. So his effects are huge. What it really means, becoming a Buddhist, means that people cease to identify themselves by these artificial categories of caste. So they cease to understand that they belong to this strata, that strata, that strata. Mainly it's people from the so-called lower strata, but they cease to identify themselves in that way. They identify themselves simply as Buddhists, as individuals who go for refuge to the three jewels. And this is beyond understanding the effects of this. It's very slow. But I think people don't even realize in India how, as I say, seismic it is. It's like an earthquake that's very, very deep, that's slowly rippling out and shaking up Indian society.
And I was thinking, you mentioned a while back to me that those communities who converted to Buddhism, they've traced or tracked how they're progressing sort of socially. Do you want to say a bit about that?
Yes. Well, in the census information that we get from the government of India's 10-yearly census, we can see that the difference between the educational, social, economic, and employment situation of those who converted to Buddhism compared with those from similar castes, from the similar sort of strata, because everybody belongs somewhere in a strata, and those who've converted have improved themselves out of all measure in comparison to those who didn't convert. There has been some improvement generally, because many have taken Dr. Ambedkar's message, but they've not taken the message of conversion. One of the statistics that sort of shocked me most was that it's well known that the proportion of female infants to male infants is not what it should be. I think nature produces more females than males. Is that right?
Yeah.
I can't remember, but whichever it is. But actually, in general, in India, there are fewer females than males, because, of course, if you know you're going to have a female child, even though it's illegal, you abort. If not, you may kill the child, and it's not a huge thing, but it's statistically significant amongst Buddhists. The proportion is what it should be, which speaks volumes.
Yeah. So actually, that sort of rejecting caste and the caste it actually has all kinds of effects in the whole of your life.
It's rejecting a whole culture within which caste is embedded and which also caste supports.
Okay. So you mentioned in there where you could insert race into when you were talking about the Buddha. So what differences are there or similarities between the race system that we have, the hierarchy based on race, and the system of caste? What's the difference and similarities?
Right. Well, caste is an extraordinarily complex phenomenon, and there's no really clear understanding of its origins. But it's like a mixture of class, of race, because of course Dalits tend to be darker in color, and in India whiter or lighter is better, and economic status. There's a whole number of different factors, but I think what is remarkably similar, well, of course, apart from the fact that it is a hierarchical system in which those at the bottom of the hierarchy are effectively oppressed and have limited opportunities. For instance, Dalits were not supposed to get education, and so on. Really, really drastic. So there are similarities in that respect, in that racism, to use that horrible word, historically has meant that those who are considered black were excluded from the full participation in society. So it's similar in that way. I think it's also similar in a rather radical way, which I think Buddhist understanding gives us a privileged position in. It's basically a mental construction. Dr. Ambedkar made this very, very clear that, well, he says in a very important work called Annihilation of Caste, which he gave before he became a Buddhist, but he was already very strongly influenced by Buddhism. But he said caste is a notion, a state of mind. And elsewhere, he said something to the effect that what mind creates, mind can undo. And this could be our moral for this conversation. So caste is very obviously a construction. It's very obvious to me because I come from a different culture where we don't have caste. I always make clear to my Indian friends, we have our own hierarchies, but then they're not caste. So caste is a mystery to me. It's not part of my mind, as it were. I've learnt about it, and I can even now begin to identify people's caste by their names and behavior and so on, which I fear that tendency, but it's not mine, as it were. And that shows, that reveals its constructed character. It's what Buddhism would describe as a concept, a nimitta, a sign, but it's a second order sign. It's a mental construction, a conceptual construction. Race is the same, actually. There's no such thing as race. No. It's a false idea that grew up under pseudoscience, which got added on to the whole idea of the supremacy of Europeans and so forth. Not going to go into all the details, but ultimately it's a complete fiction. You come under the heading of black. You're not exactly black. No. And I come under the heading of white. And look at me, I'm red. And even more red when you ask me embarrassing questions. So it's a construction.
And they can obviously trace with caste. I remember reading Ambedkar, he was trying to find the origins, wasn't he? And it was difficult to find the origins because it's thousands of years old, as it were. But with race, they can actually start pinpointing the point when they started separating people out. It's like 500 years or so ago, they started separating. And it's science, but also economics was a major part of it as well, sort of a justification, as it were, for the dominance, as you say. So so race and caste are constructs. They're fabricated concepts, as it were. They don't exist in reality.
They don't exist in reality.
So in that, and so the Buddha saying, he didn't say this, but you saying that when I asked that question about him being anti-caste, yes, emphatically so. And there's lots of talk, of course, about being anti-racist. And I remember when I was growing up, being an anti-racist or wearing an anti-racist slogan was a very sort of political, strident act, it seems, at the time. The situation was very polarized in a particular kind of way. Whereas now I've been thinking, well, what is it to be? Can a Buddhist be anti-racist? What would it be for a Buddhist to be anti-racist? Is it really a certain awareness or commitment to change? So I wanted to ask you what you think, how we should relate to a term like anti-racist, I guess. Do you consider yourself, Subhuti, anti-racist?
Well, yes and no, not in the political sense, but in the human sense. Yes, I'm emphatically against the discrimination against anybody on any basis, apart from in terms of worth, of moral and spiritual values. And even then, I wouldn't want to discriminate, but I'd acknowledge that there are differences between people on that basis, but it is not to do with any adventitious matter of birth. So no, I'm emphatically against it, and it's part of my own spiritual practice is to try to overcome any barriers that I have in my mind. And I'm more or less successful. And
well, I'm going to ask you about that, but you can ask me as well. Don't be shy. I'm going to ply you with questions. But don't be shy. You can ask me, but I'm going to ask you.
I'm going to ask you first. Are you still anti-racist, and are you happy about being defined as anti-racist?
Okay, that's a good question. Well, if I think about it as if I think about it in a political way, then no, as you say. But if I think about it as actually it's a commitment to really understanding any bias or prejudice I have, that sort of conscious, semi-conscious, unconscious. If it is that process, then yes, I would say I'm anti-racist. And I also would say that it's about, then for me it's a question of ethics, actually. Ultimately it's a question of kind of what's motivating my actions. Are they being motivated by fear or hatred or ignorance, actually, subtly or not, and a commitment not for that not to happen, because I think we imbibe the society in which we live. We swim in the waters, as it were, of so many different conditioning factors. So it's not that I don't expect that to be their bias and prejudice, but it's more that I understand my responsibility to transform it.
Yeah.
And I'm committed to that. And I'm committed to helping others do that, or creating a context whereby we can actually see each other as we are, and not with the sort of blinkers of conditioning there. Yeah. So in that sense, I'm an anti-racist.
Yeah, good. we'll meet on that basis.
We agree. Okay, I'm going to ask you, I met, as you know, I think I showed you the pictures. I met Angela Davis last year, and which is now she's being interviewed and around the world. And yeah, that was her slogan. It's not enough to not be racist. Sure. One has to be anti-racist, and I really sort of been mulling that over in that time. But let's go back to the sort of construct, the race as a construct.
Yeah.
You said that you've been working on your conditioning. I just said about me, the way I approach this, I guess. Tell me about, when did you consciously start working on race and potential race bias, or your thoughts and conditioning around race?
Right. Well, I suppose for me, it's my training in India that has been the basis for my thinking about these things. So, since I've been working in India, which I have done since 1985, and these days I spend, well, if COVID-19 permitting, I spend 6 months each year in India, and I go there to a community of people who are mostly from the Dalit section of society, who therefore it's right in the front, it's right in my face. And Dr. Ambedkar is their wonderful leader, and he's now my leader too. So I come from that point of view. But really, I began to look more closely at issues within Britain and my own issues in relation to that. As president of the LBC, when a very good friend who was very, very friendly to me right from the start, Jana, who I like to dedicate this conversation to, because she's a big figure, and also Vijaya Tara, who is a big figure in my, being able to talk to somebody who is classified as black, as it came under the category of black, about these issues. And Jana was a pretty tough teacher, and she tackled me very, very hard. And she liked the fact that I didn't roll over, and we had very, very good straight discussions. And she's been badgering me for years. Look, you're working in Hungary, with the Roma problem. You're working with Dalits in India. Why don't you do something here? So, Shana, here I am. I'm trying. But yes, it was those conversations with her, and then with Vijaya Tara, a very, very sweet woman, so sad that she died tragically quite young with cancer, with a brilliant, brilliant career before her. And she'd overcome so much, and especially because of a terrible racial abuse. But they really educated me. But I have to say, it was probably about 15 years ago that you and I, Suryagupta, met. I can remember in the library at the LBC, I can remember where we were sitting and all. And I just put it to you straight, what is your experience of racism? I've heard from Jana, I've heard from Vijaya Tara. What is your experience? Is it the same? And in your very careful and thoughtful way, you explained to me, telling me some pretty shocking stories, which resonate in my mind, and just horrific. Not horrific in the sense that you're beaten up or something like that, but just responses, automatic responses from people, which when you were doing something well-meaning. And I found that very, very shocking. And so, yes, I've sort of then had to think about all of that. And, more recently, I've been thinking a lot more about it, particularly since you become chair, because I've now got a context. We've got a context within which we can try to do something about this. Before, if not really had an outlet. Jana will say that I have had one, but I haven't taken it. And she may be right, but I haven't seen a way to do it. But in our conversations together, I've been able to, it's not that I have arrived at any new understandings, but I've been able to articulate understandings that I've had in the privacy of my own brain, as it were. I very, very much valued that.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, we're going for a tea break in a minute, but when we come back, I'm going to ask you more about this and share with you how I received some of those conversations that we've had. No, it's been fine, don't worry. But there was definitely some turning points for me in in our discourse around it as well. And I'd like to it would be good for us to share that. And then obviously we come back for questions as well. There's loads we could talk about. It's such a big area.
I know.
And we're just sort of scratching the surface. We sort of laid out the context of race and caste, hierarchies, the social constructs, but actually have a deep impact on all aspects of people's lives, on my life, many people's lives I know, on all of our lives, in that we operate with blinkers, and part of the act of transformation is learning how to remove that. So when we come back, I'm going to ask Subhuti some more questions around our specific personal conversations, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Can I just mention one thing that I had meant to say, but the pace of events. I've visited Hungary for the last 14 years, and I've become, I feel, deep friends with 2 or 3 of those people from the Roma community, and I found that very powerful. Again, I'm white, but I'm not Hungarian white. And I'm a participant, but I'm not a participant. And I found that very, very revealing.
And I think it's also just the thing of, so your experience, like engaging and meeting with these communities and understanding their situation. And then I'm sure, and again, we can touch on this, I'm sure that then helps you reflect back on the community that you've been part of and grew up in, and race. And for example, I was reminded today that like Black women, for example, in this country, because we can think that we're think we've got equal laws and all of that, but Black women, for example, in this country are 5 times more likely to die in childbirth, for example. And the only 2 women I've known who have died in childbirth have been Black. And British Pakistani and Black Africans were 2.5 times likely to die of COVID-19. So it's still having its impact. So in a way that sort of can propel us to want to take action at least. But let's come back to a personal perspective when we come back after the break. Please have a good cup of tea and rest. Do what you need to do to refresh yourselves basically. And see you back here at, should we say, Sanjay, give me a time check, 8 o'clock still? That gives us 8 minutes. 8 o'clock? All right, let's come back here at 8 o'clock then. See you then.
Okay.
So, Sanjay, send me a message when we can start. Back.
We seem to be live.
We seem to be live. Lovely. There you are, Subhuti. Okay, so thank you. So welcome back, everybody. Settle in again. We're going to continue where we left off. And there's actually something else I wanted to come back to. I had a quick look at the chat, which was really helpful. And some of your questions already coming in. And one of them was about, which I did want to bring up actually, about the idea, we both said, oh, well, not in a political sense that we're anti-racist.
Oh, yeah, good.
And I thought of that afterwards, and I thought, well, that for me, that means I'm not part of a political party, you know, that's, or even a campaign group right now. I'm not particularly part of that. I do actually support a number of activists in various ways. So
good.
you know, I have done through my life, but I'm not part of a political group right now. So I guess that's what I was thinking of.
Yeah.
But there is a problem actually with the way we think about, or at least there's a conflict, I think, the way we think about politics in Buddhism, as it were. At the London Buddhist Centre, we have in our constitution, we say we're not engaged in politics, party politics. But I remember for myself, one of the things that made me feel I could be a Buddhist for the rest of my life was hearing about two figures. I heard about Dada Rinpoche, who was one of Bante's teachers, Bante Sanghawachu's teachers, and they talked about him as like a bodhisattva, somebody who's really working to alleviate the suffering of all beings. And he spent his time, hours in meditation, as well as giving teachings, but actually running a school for Tibetan refugees and teaching them their culture and, you know, confidence, and just giving them what they needed really to live happy, healthy human lives. And I was very inspired by him, because somehow or other he was responding to the immediate needs around him, as well as teaching as a Buddhist. And then, of course, hearing about Dr. Ambedkar. And Dr. Ambedkar is a very interesting case because he wanted to transform society. And through that, obviously, people had to transform themselves. But he didn't seem to see that distinction between the individual and the society in that way. And for me, when I heard his story, I felt that I can be a Buddhist, because one of my fears was that I would get very just focused on myself and living a very nice life and forget the suffering that I'd grown up with, which was race and poverty, and somehow or other, just live a nice life myself and get more and more distant. So for me, Buddhism has always had that sense of how do we transform society? So I just wanted your take on that.
So you're uneasy about saying not a political take on anti-racism, how would you put it? Interestingly, this occurred to me while I was having a rest as well. But yeah, how would you put it?
I don't know how I put it. It was more that you know, I guess I distinguish between party politics and political. Actually, there was a quote today that I came up with, which somebody mentioned on the chat, that justice is love. It's Cornell West. Justice is love in the public sphere, as it were. And I kind of thought about that today. I heard it earlier today, and I kind of thought, well, actually, why is a lot of my career or life been spent supporting people trying to make change in the world? Because I see that suffering comes from how we do things, from some of our policies, some of our practices. It affects our conditioning, doesn't it? You know, just how we do things and what we expect, and what a difference it can make. So for me, I don't think of myself. I'm not part of a political party, but I want to make a change in the world. I see the difference. It can. I was in, you know, I went to South Africa. I've been to South Africa a few times, and coming back from South Africa, particularly Cape Town, where I was, hugely shocking, you know, how things still are there. And I remember saying to a South African friend of mine, I don't know how I would have been if I was living in this all of the time. I don't know what effect it would have had on my basic confidence. So and that is because of the laws and that, you know, all the policies I've created over years. So for me, there isn't actually much a distinction.
Yeah.
You know, I think society does matter in terms of how we function as individuals.
Yeah. Well, I'm very glad you brought it up. I would have brought it up myself, actually, because it suddenly grated on my nerves, because you know, denying the political dimension of anti-racism might seem to think that it was simply something you did on your cushion. And what I'm concerned about is not buying into any particular ideology. So you know, famously, the Anti-Racism League was set up by the Socialist Workers' Party in the 70s, and so it was dominated by a political, a particular political ideology, and Buddhism is against ideology, what are called views, ditti, drishti. So what I'm an anti-racist from a Buddhist perspective, and I believe that means, as you eloquently pointed out, actually working to change things.
Yeah. So that's really important to get clear, because one of the things I've noticed is when there are these conversations around race, it gets very theoretical, quite ideologically, quite quickly. And I want to often say, this is about suffering.
Yes.
You know, this whole thing, this whole experience we're living in now came about through a person's suffering and an ultimate death. And it's about alleviating that, and then all the things that create that, all the conditions that lead that to being the case, which are very extensive. It's not just the police; it's all the factors. So for me, I always want to come back to: are we willing to alleviate suffering that is going on out there, but also the suffering that we create in our own minds about how we relate to others?
It has to begin with that. It has to begin with dealing with it within ourselves. This is something Dr. Ambedkar emphasized a lot, that there's so many social activists who are not very good people, and well, you can't do good on a bad basis. So and also social activists who are burnt out because the basis is not solid. And I agree with you. I've seen, even within our own order and movement, even currently, ideological debates, neither of which side I can identify with, because they seem to drift away from what you've said, which is the plain fact that people have suffered. And that, well, we had a message this morning, didn't we, from a Mitra who is really glad we're having this conversation. It reminded him of being targeted by neo-Nazi groups when he was growing up, and sort of, I've never had that, but it's a common experience. And that's what we have to deal with, not an ideological take on it all, which then removes us from the human facts.
And it also, I think, removes us from our own personal responsibility, actually, to ethical responsibility, when we get into that kind of intellectual debate, as it were. It's not that we can't borrow, for me, I borrow concepts, I borrow ideas to help understand certain phenomena, certain experiences I'm having.
Them advisedly.
But borrowing them. The reality is, what I guess there's two things I look for in my life and have looked for, is to alleviate my own and other suffering, but also to fulfill potential. And of course, if you're in such an unequal hierarchical situation, it suppresses and oppresses people's potential.
Indeed.
As well. So okay, so good. We sort of agreed on that one. So I wanted to go back to the conversation, I guess, that we started having years ago, because there was a pivotal point in that for me, where you said, when you talked about me, that first conversation we had in the LBC library, you said that I carefully and shared with you some experiences or whatever. And I don't remember that one particularly, but I do remember one where you met me and a number of my friends. I think Vijayatara might even have been there. Jana was probably there. It was a group of us. Vimala Sara. There's a few of us. And we were all very strong characters, actually. And I sat there and we were all kind of sharing our views and perspectives, because you're the president, not because you're the president, because you had influence at the centre. And I remember you just listening to us, and obviously asking us a few things, but just listening. And I think it must have been maybe, I don't know, 10 years, or it was a significant number of years later, you wrote to me.
Yeah.
Do you remember? And you said that you apologized.
Yeah.
You apologized for that conversation. You said that I think you said that you felt, you realized you were defensive.
Yes.
In that conversation.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, oh, I didn't notice that. I just noticed that we were just sharing our views, and you were politely being, maybe being English, very politely listening
I'm
to
afraid
us.
so, yes, English middle class.
I didn't notice that you were outright sort of defensive, as it were. You weren't outright defensive. It was, if it was quite subtle for me. But that was a changing moment for me personally, because all those years later, you wrote to me and you sort of confessed, and you sort of said that you wanted to have more authentic, open communication. I think you realized that had got in the way for you.
Right.
And it changed my response to you, because I realized, I thought, oh yeah, I sort of, I am, you get good, you get quite good or skilled at having careful conversations, really, whereby you're not overly upsetting somebody and you're sort of managing it, basically. And after that, I felt that, oh, you're really taking this seriously. You're really taking the potential effect you might have had really seriously. You've thought about it a lot, and you want something to be different. And I personally think it's from there, that point, that I felt more able to talk with you openly, or one of the few people that I do, in terms of white order members that I do speak openly with. And I felt that because you did sort of I felt that you took it really seriously, the effect, as it were, of natural defenses, perhaps, because it wasn't an easy conversation that you were in either. So for me, that sort of gave me an indication, I think, of, well, how can we encourage that more? How can we encourage more of us, I guess, to engage in these open conversations? What are the conditions that we need to have them, where we don't get into theoretical debate for theoretical debate's sake? We don't put up defences to stop somebody sharing, in a sense, their experience. How can we sort of what do we need to do as Buddhists, as it were, to really get to the heart of this, to deconstruct it? Because obviously there's race, which is an artificial construct, but racism is lived, and it's lived through direct experience.
I suppose it's the same way as you overcome all polarities. As I say, I see that all human interaction, unless you're really very self-aware, involves a degree of polarity. So that as soon as I'm sitting with another person, there's a consciousness of difference. And what communication consists in is trying to go beyond the difference to meet, as it were, without denying the difference, but meet without the difference being a barrier. And meet at a level which is beyond the polarity. And that goes for any polarity, just the bare polarity of self and other, and the polarity of man and woman, of Englishman and Frenchman, whatever it may be. Class is a big issue for me in my life, probably the biggest issue in my early life. And of course, race is another one, because any interaction in which I am conscious of myself coming under the category of white, and of you as coming under the category of black, is fraught with sensitivities, if you see what I mean. I bring sensitivities to it. I assume you bring, or I wonder whether you bring sensitivities to it. I don't really know, but I may even assume that you have sensitivities to it. So how are we going to get beyond that? Well, we're going to get beyond it by opening up to each other and being honest with each other, and exploring with each other, as you and I have done. But I think it is important to recognize that racism and all that goes with that, which is this extra delicacy, extra sensitivity that goes on when two people under these two different categories encounter each other, is part of a general phenomenon. Do you see what I mean? It's part of the fundamental human situation.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
it's particularly spiced, if you like. It's particularly loaded. You asked me the other day about my circle of friends. Well, I have loads of friends in India. I have friends in Hungary, but I have very few black friends, actually. People coming under the category of black. Just a handful. It's not choice. It's just sort of the accident of things, if you see what I mean. I'm not active in a centre anymore. I'd love to have more interaction across all sorts of boundaries. I'm fascinated, but you know that you found that very interesting when I said that yeah.
Well, it was more that I mean, a lot of people in our movement don't necessarily have a very broad circle of friends. London's apart, you know, but in the rest of the place. But it was more that you were talking about you experiencing your whiteness, as it were, and beginning, you know, really being interested in that as a construct. Because I think sometimes with the race conversation, the focus is on the black experience or the color experience, but it's kind of like actually it's a dynamic that happens that's based on inferiority, superiority in a way, but that kind of I was quite interested that you sort of took on exploring what it was for you to be in a white body, I guess.
Well, I guess, for instance, with that conversation we had in the Gallery Cafe with a group of your black they're all women friends, I was actually quite intimidated, if you see what I mean. That was the truth of it. It wasn't so much that I was defensive. It was more like I just felt very shy and intimidated, and I was sorry about that, because I missed an opportunity for interaction. Partly it was just because they were pretty loud and vigorous, if you see what I mean. It's not the way I'm used to communicating, but it was spiced with the fact, as I'm putting it, that they were black. Do you see what I mean? So I was wondering, well, you know, how do they see me? And how do I interact in this situation? I wanted to. It's not a reluctance. It's just that I was extra sensitive. I've grown up a lot since then.
Yes, that was a long time ago.
a lot tougher now, and a lot more self-confident. And I've experienced myself beyond polarities, if you see what I mean, at least for moments. But yes, I think that as most white people, when they come into a relationship with black people, will be conscious of the categories, if you see what I mean. The sort of people we'll be in contact with, the white people we're in contact with in the Buddhist world, will not hold racist views, but they would in the overt sense, but they will have varying degrees of sensitivity of varying kinds. I would imagine, I'm guessing, guilt, uncertainty, how do I relate? Fear, am I being accused? A number of people I've spoken to, white people I've spoken to, have felt accused by the Black Lives Matter business, which you don't need to be. It's not the issue. And I think the way that, set aside the slogan and some of the uses that are made of it, I think the movement generally is not ideologized. And there's no need to feel threatened by it, but more how can you have a helpful response? But I think that is general for all of for white people, I would guess. Maybe I'm wrong, but and I sense that in myself, although, you know, I'm no longer intimidated by that in myself. Partly because I say I've experienced myself beyond that sort of polarity.
Okay, that's quite interesting. So do you want to say, just so we understand what that means, can you actually say anything more about that or not?
Before we do that, can I
go on then, ask me a question.
About the, you know, I talked a little bit about how it is as a white person, you know, a pretty well-meaning one, or broadly speaking. I've never held those sort of racist views in the ideological sense, but I'm sensitive. I've been sensitive around it. Jhana soon put paid to that, but you know, through having that sort of vigorous interaction with her, with you, Vijayatara, one or two others as well. So, but how is it for you?
In regards to
you know, this interaction between you under the category of black, me under the category of white, or anybody under the category of white?
Well, in a sense, you know, growing up in as a visible minority, you sort of get used to being like either the only black person, or there's just a few of you, or the only person of color, and I get used to navigating the world in a certain sense. But I think the George Floyd sort of, you know, what's happened has definitely made me reflect again on my experience. And that's sort of what I described as that sort of managing and editing conversations. And I realized, gosh, that's quite a lot that I do that. I sort of, you know, because of the sensitivity, as you put it, you know, of others, I realize I do edit out some of my actual experience quite a lot. Well, I don't know how much I do it, but I realize, oh yes, that's something I do. And I think why I've realized it is because suddenly there's conversations everywhere around race in every sphere of life, it seems. I was joking with the people of color group about, you know, even my veg delivery company are talking about race, you know, so it's kind of like everywhere I look, you know, there's a conversation. And you're also having people who, again, publicly maybe have never spoken about race, talking about their experience, black people, this is, and people of color. And so for me, it's the sort of lid's been removed, as it were, on my experience. And I'm thinking, gosh, actually, it's had more of an effect in some ways than I might have done. In a way, usually I'm just getting through my life. I'm doing what I need to do, living my life. It's always there, but you have to get on. And suddenly I'm examining much more how it's impacting, and the fact that how many conversations have I had openly, honestly, around my experience of race? Would I like to have more? And if so, how? And I'd like to hear more from, you know, my white friends, for example, about their experience. Because, you know, one's often sometimes put in the position where people, if you do get into the position of talking about it, people want to hear your experience. I'm thinking, well, it's a two-way thing, which is why I like the other, you know, when we last spoke, that you were just deconstructing your experience of being white, you know, I was like, it's very refreshing for me, because then it's kind of like we're both conscious of race, and its impact, and the fact that you spoke a while ago about that you can knock on any door. You've never had experience of having any barriers. You can go anywhere. It seems like do anything, and there's no sense of barriers. Whereas my experience is often that, you know, I'm having to prove or demonstrate or convince, or you know, people sort of seem to, you know, you have to prove yourself before you're kind of, oh yeah, you're right, really, Suryagupta. You know, so I find that fascinating, just as us even exchanging that, and actually then knowing, gosh, when we're in this conversation, I do feel that the barriers get removed. I do feel that we are just talking about human experience then, from two different dimensions. And then that's very freeing.
So just to encapsulate what it's not quite the way I would like to put it, but let me put it rather bluntly. What would you like from us whiteys?
Don't say that.
Sorry. You know, what would you like from what is it that you want to happen in relation to, from the side of those under the category of white? I insist on putting it like that. I mean, this is just my personal opinion, and you know, there'll be a spectrum of views and opinions, and it'd be interesting in a moment to hear some questions. For me, the first thing was this thing of recognizing it's there. I was very moved by a guy called Van Jones. I heard him speak on a podcast, and he was saying this whole event that's happened around the world is like a miracle. He said it's a complete miracle. And the miracle was the fact that people have recognized it's there, and it's having a damaging impact on Black people and people of color and society as a whole. And because of this separation, because of this constant having to
figure out whether we're safe or not safe, with each other. And he was saying it's a complete miracle, and all he's ever wanted was for it to be recognized. And I think that's been important for me, just this recognition, but also how subtle it can play out. Really, it can play out quite subtly in our experience. So I'd like recognition, and I think this sort of deeper awareness, actually being interested in it. I've been working on some level, on some version of my race conditioning or my experience of race since I was 6, because that's when it first appeared to me that I was in a particular, I fell off the climbing frames at school, and I remember slightly concussed walking home. My sister was in front of me, but walking home and looking around my environment and seeing racist slogans, on the wall, but also I felt poverty as well. I saw that there was a sort of misery in the air, and I just thought this is wrong somehow, and I felt the hostility around me. And so really from then I've been like trying to understand what it's about, and then how to navigate it, really. So if more and more people get interested in it, as it were, and begin to explore this construct and how it impacts on all our experience, I think it will help. It will help people like me, not feel like, oh, it's just my job to do that. But also, it will be freeing. I think it will be freeing for us, because we can actually then get to our potential, our collective potential, and how we relate to each other. That sort of interdependency, that interconnectedness that we actually all are. But without doing that sort of without exploring our conditioning in that way, then I will keep editing out. Well, I don't have to, but that's the thing that I've learned to do: edit out aspects of my experience, because it's too uncomfortable, and because we're just not used to having the conversation. So that's what I would like: deeper awareness, and then I think that changes the dynamic. So me and you, we still have, when we speak, we still have moments where I'm like, Subhuti, let's go back on that, but actually it feels very free.
And I think it's important to keep on recognizing what you've said, I think 3 times. It's not just about being black and the problem of being black. It's the problem that within the culture that we have, there is a notion of race that we all operate within, as it were, whichever side of it you come from, and that is constraining, because in Buddhism we recognize that all constructed identities are limiting.
So we're going to go to questions, but before that, I'm going to read a quote from Martin Luther King, because this is one of my favorite quotes from him, and he says, "In a real sense, all life is interrelated. All men, all people are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. And this is an interrelated structure of reality."
Wonderful. Wonderful.
So over to questions.
Okay.
Great. So thank you both for those discussions. So I think so far in the chat there's been 2 main kind of points, but maybe there'll be a few more as we talk. But I think one of the main ones has been around this distinction that I think, Subhuti, you made at the start about between being, I think it was ethically racist versus politically anti-racist. Sorry. So a lot of the discussion is around how, this this notion that racism is actually a systemic structural problem that plays out in our systems throughout society. And actually, the other day I saw that Merriam-Webster's dictionary has added that as an actual definition of racism. So it'd be great, I think, to hear more from you both about how, well, we as Buddhists can actually address those systemic structural issues throughout society. I think there's quite a few questions about that.
So in a nutshell, we're wanting, Sanjay, in a nutshell, what's the question?
Well, I think the question is, how can we address those structural issues without, well, especially whilst we're being careful to not be political in that sense, maybe not kind of, some people were feeling like it sounded like we didn't want to take a side. So how do we actually kind of make a change in society when we're trying to be so careful to not be political?
So I think I was trying to get through that with that. I love that quote from Cornel West, that justice is love in the public sphere, as it were. Because for me, I don't think there is that distinction between what I do individually and then what we do out there. There's my ethical behavior in terms of my individual interactions, but then there's my general behavior in terms of how it has an effect in the world, what I understand about the world. So for me, I sign petitions, I help various people doing various things in the world. I think I don't see that distinction there. I think both me and Subhuti were like, why are we making that distinction? I think for me, I hear that a lot in our community about not being political. We don't have to be party political. We don't have to sign up to various, even campaigning organizations if we don't want to. We could, but being anti-racist for me is around being prepared to see our biases, see our prejudices, and take action and responsibility on that, knowing that our biases and prejudice are going to cause suffering in some way or other to others. And then seeing bias and prejudice operating in our different sectors of society. So I make certain decisions, like I'm sure other people do, about how we spend our money and how we spend our time and all of that, so that I'm not actually buying into what might be, negative situations. So I want to say, though, that I think as Buddhists, we have these really, really powerful tools. A friend of mine's written a book called Mindful of Race, Ruth King. And, she talks about mindfulness as being such a powerful tool because it helps us uproot those biases and prejudice. And of course, metta, then enables us to express that. So I think Buddhists have particular tools that we can use that have been shown to work. They work, they affect us. We build community on the basis of that. We show that it's possible, potentially, to live in a place where we can relate to each other, without those hierarchies. That's what's happened in India, in a sense. Our brothers and sisters in India now. They've got an effective community, and they're now on the front line helping people, around the COVID, and they've been able to do that because of their solidarity. So for me, mindfulness and metta enables us to really engage in solidarity with others, and that's powerful in itself. That's what we can particularly offer. We can do other things. We can work in different sectors and engage in campaigns, of course, but we've also got this to offer.
Yes,
and I wanted to ask a question just generally in the chat around what stops us from engaging in the conversation around race generally. We myself and Subhuti, we've been in this conversation. We've got different experiences. In a way, we've had this ongoing conversation based on our different experiences, trying to arrive at and keep trying to arrive at some kind of common understanding. But but what actually prevents us, or what are our fears around getting into the conversation? Because I'm fascinated by that. So that's something I'd like people to check in with if they wish in the questions as well.
If I could address the general issue that you raised, Sanjay, I think we both corrected our usage of political. So maybe those questions come from before that. But I'm glad that we both had that instinct to get free from a denigration of politics. But what I'm most concerned about is ideology, because I've often see these discussions filtered through ideological perspectives on both sides of the issue. And often a Marxist interpretation is given. And on the other side, a conservative libertarian perspective, which can be quite oddly, unintentionally racist, or rather play into the static nature of a race hierarchy. So I'm wary of ideology altogether, and I think it's something that we all need to be much more alert to. So why I think this is a very precious moment, and why I was so enthusiastic when Suryagupta contacted me, was because I think there's a sort of moment in time that there's been this huge opening up to the situation because of the very visible murder of a man, and in the context of lockdown, where there's a heightened degree of solidarity throughout the world. But I think my long experience is that these moments do not last, and they pass into something else. What they will pass into is an increasing polarization and ideological appropriation. And I think we must be really wary of that. So that's what I was talking about. It's not really politics. It's far too elastic a word, politics. Doesn't really say what I wanted to say. So what do I think, how should we engage with the issue? Well, everything that Suryagupta said so eloquently, but I would like to add to that, I think, maybe extending something that she did say, I think our Sangha is a very, very precious contribution to the world. I see this very strongly in India, that in the Sangha we can create a situation in which we let go of all these artificial constructions, and we meet each other human being to human being. And of course, we're going to start with those because we don't recognize them fully, but that we're willing to engage in the conversation that takes us to a point at which we just see each other as human beings with different backgrounds and different accidental features, blonde hair and blue eyes or not, as it were. Gray hair, brown hair, whatever. There are so many differences between us which are adventitious, that are not what we really are. So I really think it's very important that we use the Sangha. We see the significance of Sangha as a leaven to society, like yeast. That if the Sangha is successful, if it is a place where everybody feels comfortable, or at least everybody can find a way to find themselves feeling comfortable, I think it's a big, big political act. Beyond that, vote for politicians who are putting forward policies that end disadvantage, because disadvantage becomes built in. Even working class people, white working class people, are much less likely to go to university than white middle class people. Societies tend, particularly society like this, tend to be very static. So I think there needs to be active work against them.
Yeah. So I think it's like thinking about our current tools as Buddhists, our practices, our ethical practice, how that if we explore it through the race of lens, as we have done for other areas, we will begin to see our biases, we will begin to see our prejudices, we will begin to see our views, and the things that hold us back from really engaging with others. And then obviously we then have a commitment, if we wish, to then transform that. Right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I just wanted to sort of make it clear that I think that the problem is not necessarily bias. And I think this is where sometimes misunderstanding happens.
Okay, go
I
ahead.
think most of the people who come under the category of white that you and I are likely to meet do not have a bias. Probably some do, but most do not. But what they do have is the idea of race in their minds, if you see what I mean. So that then becomes a lens which creates a distance, a difficulty, an awkwardness, which
I
then
think it's a bit more. I think it's a bit more than that, because I think the thing about the bias, not the bias, the lens, as you say, is informed by history, isn't it? It's informed by the kind of inferiority, superiority context we're in. Yeah. So that's certainly my experience. My experience is definitely that, as I said before, there'll be a presumption often of me somehow not being able to make the mark, as it were, and a certain kind of rejection that goes on, and actually the experience is quite, more and more I'm thinking of it. Gosh, there's lots of little kind of rejections and hostilities and pushing back and sort of aggressions, as it were, that happens quite subtly. In a way that makes me think that people, and it's just there's this dynamic that's based on inferiority, superiority, and that gets played out. So how can we become conscious of that? What I do for myself is make sure that I recognize bias and prejudice when it's happening in my own mind, and then be able to see the consequences. So I think that's where our ethical actions are really important. See the consequences of that mindset.
Yeah.
And then we're going to ask more questions in a minute.
Yeah, I'd like to push back a bit on that.
Because go on then. This is where me and Subhuti now. You see what was happening now. We've got a difference of opinion, and we're gonna be debating it.
Hopefully,
and we'll probably continue after this conversation.
We definitely will. I think that there may be superiority on the part of white people. I don't want to speak for everybody. I don't think I've ever particularly had that.
Right.
I don't think I've ever particularly had that. I told you the story when my father was stationed in Nigeria before and after independence. And I remember my father wasn't particularly, I never heard anything of a racist kind from him, at least that I can remember. But my mother explicitly told me not to play with some of the black kids who actually, were going to English private schools like I was, but she didn't want me to. And I knew that was wrong. At the time, I knew that was wrong. So I can't say absolutely that I didn't imbibe anything. How can you really be absolutely sure?
Yeah.
But it's not a major factor in my experience of But you see, I think if you frame it around that bias, you miss the central point.
Yeah.
Which is that nonetheless, I come into a situation where I'm looking at our interaction in terms of race. I'm conscious of you as black. I'm conscious of me as white. And I'm thinking that there's something difficult here. There's something awkward here. I need to tread carefully. I need to be extra conscious and so forth. Do you see what I mean? So that it may not be that there's outright prejudice. I think most of the people that I would speak to, I'd be very surprised if there was really any solid bias. You can't. So
what I want to say here is I don't know. I don't know. What I would like is for us to explore it.
Sure.
As in a safe kind of supportive context for us just to explore it, because I don't know. I can't see what's in the mind of somebody. What I experience is sort of times where I question things. I question, what happened there? What was that about? And I think it's quite subtle. Basically, I think it's quite subtle. It's certainly in the media all the time. If you deconstruct the media, it's there, as it were, sort of this implicit sort of sense of inferiority, superiority. It's sort of there. But I think that's where, you know, I'm just curious
Right.
for us to have the conversation, to
Absolutely.
do some inquiry, and then see what we get to. You know, in a way, your experience, because you've done extensive work in India and Hungary, and you spent years in Nigeria, you know, in a way, you've got a particular set of experiences as well. So, and I've got a particular set of experiences. So, but we're going to go over to more questions now. So, Sanjay,
what I would like to ask is that I think that the one thing you can mostly guarantee is that for many, unless they've really become accustomed to this sort of dialogue, there will be white people, that is, white people coming under the category of white, will have some sense of a black-white difference.
Yes, absolutely.
They will not necessarily put that in any hierarchical form.
Right. Okay.
Not necessarily. They may.
Right. Okay.
So I think it's important that we go into the conversation recognizing that it's very likely that we share these categories.
Yes.
We may have fairly neutral relations to them. Except that they're areas of sensitivity. I think if we go into it with assuming something about the way that will be carried, I think that will, well, it's something that'll have to come out in the wash, of course.
Well, exactly. I think going into it and just being curious and open,
I think that's
and seeing what the experience is, and not presuming any experience, that at least gives us a space, doesn't it? And I think that's probably where we started our conversation. But let's go to a few questions, Subhuti, just because Sanjay is dying to ask.
We could go on forever, couldn't we?
We could go on forever. We would debate it as well. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Sanjay.
So at the risk of just carrying us on that thread, I just thought we should address this thread that's in the comments around, well, this phrase unconscious bias, and that distinction between what Subhuti's talking about here about bias that he can recognize in himself of superiority of over somebody else, and a more kind of historic conditioning that has been caused by one's kind of, well, social upbringing conditions, and Subhuti mentioned his parents' views as well. I wonder if either of you could just touch on very, very briefly just that distinction between and that existence of that more unconscious bias as well.
Yeah, so I definitely have a different view of this than Subhuti, I would say, just from what we gleaned just there. So for me, you know, I wouldn't always, you don't know really what goes on with somebody, you know, in terms of, and I don't want to ever presume actually, but certainly for me, I can go into situations and I suddenly feel like I'm being treated a bit differently than the next person. And I think, and then obviously then things are then, then cultures are created around certain ways of being as well and solidified. So for me, I think it's a real thing, unconscious bias, in the sense that we have these just implicit prejudices and, you know, feelings and thoughts and views that we've just picked up. So one thing I think is really important is that we don't go into blame. We don't go into blaming ourselves or blaming others for these views that we might discover, because they're just there. I was listening to somebody today talking about, it was Desmond Tutu, in fact, and he was saying that he was on a plane and he was really proud because there were black pilots, you know, flying the plane. This is years ago. Black pilots flying the plane, and then it went into turbulence, and he suddenly got worried because he thought, "Oh my goodness, are they going to be able to get us to safety?" And he realized that because they were black, he was feeling like this responsibility, you know, and a fear, and that was like that's what we call like an internalized sort of view, bias, as it were, or internalized racism, where he felt that he grew up in a culture where being black was an inferior thing. Being black, you weren't as good as your peers. So even though he was so stridently anti-racist, he also recognized he also carried some of those views. So I think all of us carry those views. Black people, people of color, white people, carry the views of the society that we're born in. And depending on the society you're born in, it might be worse or less. Depending on the culture, the work environment, it might be worse or less. I think the main thing is not to decide that they're not there or are there. The main thing is to be open to what arises in your experiences, which is where mindfulness and metta are really important. That's the key thing for me. Otherwise, you could spend time debating it forever and never really actually look at what goes on in your heart and mind.
Yeah. Well, I would like to endorse the latter part of what you said, but still protest about the first part.
Keep protesting.
I think I've done it enough. But yes, I think that what it's more a question, say in my own case, is not being aware enough that other people have not had the advantages that I've had.
So that's a privilege aspect.
If you like, advantage, I prefer, because privilege becomes jargonized. But yes, I have had a pretty easy life. And through no, I was going to say no fault of mine, no virtue of mine, it just happened. I was born into a particular family at a particular time. And part of that, of course, was that I was white as things unfolded. So I think that the key issue is not necessarily that you will have a bias and think that black people are inferior, or that black pilots are not going to fly as well as white ones. It would never occur to me. I'd just be worried about any pilot. But it's more that I would not realize, of course I do now, but I would not realize, Suryagupta, what it was like for you. I wouldn't realize that because it's not been like that for me. And I think that's part of it. A big part of how things happen. I think it happens in our movement.
Yeah, that's definitely part of it.
It's not easy for those who come under the category of white to recognize always what it's like for people who do not come under that category, engaging, and therefore what needs to be done in order to help, or to support, or to just recognize. I think it's actually the same with often white working class.
So conscious of time, maybe we
start wrapping up.
Maybe if I just ask another one on the people of color group that we have at the London Buddhist Centre. Suryagupta, I know that you're very involved in that, and a couple of people were asking about that, and one person who's never been before was kind of wondering about kind of why people kind of feel the need for it. So maybe it'd be interesting to hear about the value that you get from the people of color group. But then also there's kind of maybe this is probably a bit more complicated, but personally I'm quite interested in this as a person who's visibly white but half Indian. What a kind of person of color kind of means in terms of that group. So somebody else was asking about, they're not sure if their kind of category would be well received in that group. So there's kind of two questions.
Very briefly, that's a big area. So the thing is, what we started these events like 30 odd years ago. So we were actually one of the pioneering groups, people sanghas that started these, and we did that because we were finding that we were having particular experiences in a sangha that it was hard to talk about within the broader sangha, and as a result, it was affecting our general awareness and general development, as it were. And we needed a space where we could actually explore what does it mean to be a visible minority, in a mainly white sangha. How do we explore our experiences of race conditioning? When it involves, say, some difficulties with the white sort of majority place. So in a way, it felt really important to have that space. For me personally, it was around friendship. I really wanted to get to know other Black people who are practicing, what was it like for them? Really, it was a major support for me. I don't think I would have gotten ordained if I hadn't been taken under the wings by a couple of people of color at the time. And in a way, we keep doing that. We keep extending the hand of friendship. So mostly it's about friendship, but secondly, it's also about a space where you can safely explore your conditioning, safely talk about your experiences in the broader sangha, and have the confidence then to stay engaged in the broader sangha and share your experiences in the broader sangha, knowing that you've been able to process it safely. So that's the key aim. And in terms of the in a way we say it's Black, African, Asian, mixed heritage. So if you're from any of those categories, then you're very welcome if you identify in that way.
Great.
Just say very briefly, although this is not, as it were, my specialist topic, I think that we generally try to create spaces where people who have particular affinities can come together, the better that they can integrate into the larger Sangha. So we even have separate activities for men and women, because you can discover better what it is to be a man, or presumably what it is to be a woman,
and non-binary, of course,
and non-binary, and for I don't know what the categories are now, but used to be a gay group, but because people have a special experience which you need to come fully to terms with, so that you can then integrate into the larger.
So I'm going to Sanjay. Where are you, Sanjay? It's just to kind of, So what we hope for this conversation was that we would just share the ongoing, as you see, an ongoing discussion that myself and Subhuti. So I'm pretty sure Subhuti and I are going to be talking about unconscious bias for some time now to come, and what it means. And I'm looking forward to that. And about the things around advantage and privilege and all that kind of stuff. So that's going to continue, Subhuti and I. What we hope was that you would we'd find ways for the Sangha just to start the conversation publicly, because what I was finding is that we were a bit reticent about having a public conversation. So it's never comfortable. What I would say, when you start a conversation, it's not always comfortable. It's certainly engaging for me. It's certainly interesting, not always comfortable, but I've learned about Subhuti this evening. I've learned through the questions that have come through, and I certainly hope that we can safely, constructively have more of these conversations. And it might be that you do it in groups that you feel more comfortable with to begin with, so that you build up that sort of language and sort of awareness about what it even means to be in a conversation. And I want to end with an appeal. Is that right, Sanjay?
That's right. Yeah. We've got
right. I'm waiting for your guidance, but I'm going to end with an appeal, because I said that I'm go on, Subhuti.
I would like to continue this conversation in this way.
Really? Are you sure?
I've got a lot more to say.
Well, so have I.
Yeah, I think we could profitably continue. But anyway, make your appeal.
All right then. All right. Well, I'm going to hold that. Maybe we have another one of these conversations, and you can send your questions in advance if we do that. That would be interesting for us as well. So the appeal is this whole of this week, the Buddhist Centre is giving all of its donations to the India Dharma Trust to support the work in India. What's happened with lockdown is that obviously many migrant families have been left without any resources. They don't have the same social security system and bailouts that we've been having here. They've been left without resources, and our teams, our Buddhists on the ground, our friends on the ground have been working tirelessly to literally feed people on the front line, because they're an effective community, because they're a harmonious community, our Buddhist brothers and sisters out there, they're able to mobilize and really make a difference to those communities. And so we're giving all our donations at the Buddhist Centre to help their work. £3,000 enables one of our order members out there to work really, to actually, for a whole year, to work to help people engage in the Dharma, but also support the community they're part of. So I'd really invite you to give. I'm going to be giving. We're suggesting about, if you can contribute £50, that would be amazing. But anything you can contribute today, the links in the chat, anything you can contribute today would be really helpful. I think if we're inspired to make a difference in society, not just individually, but in society, then this is an opportunity to act and to take action in a positive way. And we can pretty much guarantee it will really have a huge effect on those order members working and the broader community. So please give. That it's in the chat there. And Sanjay.
Great. I think that's a great place to end. So thank you both. Thank you, Suryagupta. Thank you, Subhuti, for a really lively, enlightening evening. Yeah,
and
thanks.
I just want to say, I want to just appreciate all of you for joining in this conversation, because Subhuti and I didn't know how it was going to go. I never know how conversations with Subhuti are going to go. They go in all directions. And what I do know, though, is it's an important conversation for us to have and to keep having, so we can begin to understand its flavor, so we can begin to think about, and I'm going to invite you to think about this deeper awareness that we're exploring. How can it make a difference in our immediate Sangha and in the world? How does bringing mindfulness and metta into our communications, into our awareness around race, make a difference in the world? I think we've got a lot to offer as a community if we engage in this way. So yeah, thank you very much for joining and for your general support. And please give.
Great. Thanks very much.
So how do we end? Is that it? Transference of merit? Or have I finished?
Are you still there, Sanjay?
I'm still here, Subhuti. You still there?
Yep. Go on,
Transference of merit? Should we just do it anyway?
We'll do it anyway. Yeah.
Why don't you do the transference of merit and I'll go in the strip.
May the merit gained in my acting thus go to the alleviation of the suffering of all beings. My personality throughout my existences, my possessions and my merit in all three ways, I give up without regard to myself for the benefit of all beings. Just as the earth and other elements are serviceable in many ways to the infinite number of beings inhabiting limitless space, so may I become that which maintains all beings situated throughout space, so long as all have not attained to peace.